Perhaps it makes sense that Michigan Central Station, a train stop in a city and state so synonymous with the car, had spent 30 years of its life derelict and disused. What may be surprising, though, is that it was the Ford Motor Company, Michigan's famous automobile manufacturers, that brought this historic train station back to life. You're listening to Tall Stories, a Monocle production brought to you by the team behind The Urbanist. I'm Andrew Tuck. In this episode, Mandy Sinclair unpacks the history of Michigan Central Station and explores the facility's new mixed-use personality.
When I was last here at Michigan Central Station in Detroit, the Beaux-Arts building retained an element of grandeur, despite being surrounded by barbed wire fencing, not having any windows in the 18-story tower above. The exterior fixtures had been largely removed, and there was little movement on the vast plot of land surrounding the once grand train station. That was in 2015. The building's original architects, Warren and Wetmore and Reed and Stem, also designed New York City's Grand Central Station, with construction starting at the Detroit site in 1910. And in 1913, when the doors to Michigan Central Station in Detroit opened, it was touted as one of America's most spectacular transportation hubs, with up to 4,000 passengers making their way through the station on a daily basis. But following years of declining interest in rail travel, the last train left the station on January 5, 1988, and the station was shuttered. Over the years, it became a place for graffiti artists to leave their mark, DJ sets, and parties that weren't exactly sanctioned. And as the building, open to the elements, deteriorated further, its future started to look bleak. I met with Dan Austin from Michigan Central Station during the last weekend of Summer at the Station, an event held on weekends since the station reopened in June, with up to 8,000 people per day queuing up to step inside and preview the newly restored station and relive its history.
This building means so much to so many people. It had been a symbol of Detroit's decline for more than a generation, for like 40 years, and to take that symbol of decline, disinvestment, the downfall of Detroit, as some might say, and turn it into a symbol of Detroit's rebirth and reinstatement as a leader in innovation, it's an incredibly powerful message. And that's not even taking into account all of the people whose families arrived in Detroit at the station to come work in Henry Ford's auto factory. Construction started in the station in 1910. Detroit had about 465,000 people, far fewer than it has even today. 10 years later, by 1920, we're at 1 million. So the city's population more than doubled. And we're not talking 10,000 to 20,000. We're talking 465 to 1 million in 10 years. And a big part of that was because Henry Ford had perfected the assembly line the same year the station opened. And then just weeks after this building opened on December 26, 1913, in January of 1914, Henry Ford unveiled the $5 workday, creating the middle class in America and having everybody and their brothers wanting to come to Detroit for these jobs. And many, many of them came through the station. Back in 2009, the Detroit City Council voted in favor of using federal funds to demolish this building. But because the building is on the National Register of Historic Places, there's a stipulation that says you cannot use federal funds to demolish something on the National Register. So the building dodged a bullet. I mean, the vote was cast to level this building, but it was saved.
In 2018, though, with a $950 million commitment, the Ford Motor Company acquired the building and began a 6-year restoration process that wasn't without its challenges. Remarkably, even the original quarry was reopened to source limestone needed to repair or replace the building's exterior to ensure the restored areas matched the original exterior.
So Ford announced that it had acquired the building in June of 2018. And then the first 6 months, 9 months, we're just trying to stabilize the building so that we could work on restoring it. So for instance, there were 2.5 million gallons of water in the basement. We had to treat it and then pump it out, and then you had more water pumping back in because there were leaks places and identifying those leaks. So once we got all that done, we worked on trying to dry out the building because all of that water for almost 40 years, it's stone, it's brick, it's concrete, marble, it's like a giant refrigerator. So it was very, very damp, which in fact wreaked havoc with the plaster in the building. stabilizing the plaster to make sure that we could save everything that could be saved. Then we had a massive storm event here in 2021, and another 1 million gallons of water flooded back into the basement, so we had to pump that out again. But we had hired a mostly Detroit crew. The construction leads on the project were Detroit-based, and they set out to just accomplish the impossible. 3,100 men and women working 1.7 million combined hours. It was really a labor of love, and every single worker I've talked to, I didn't talk to all 3,100, but every worker I've talked to has talked about this being such an honor to be able to accomplish what so many said was impossible, but also to give this building back to the community. And most of those 3,100 men and women are Michiganders, so it's really a project by Detroit, for Detroit, and also a testament that we say nothing stops Detroit.
Yeah, exactly.
And this is certainly the latest example.
And when it came time to start finishing the building's interior, while architectural drawings and renderings were available, many of the original furnishings, light fixtures, friezes, and even clocks, had been removed for scrap metal and even safekeeping while the building sat vacant.
We did a reach out asking people if they had any pieces of the station that might have wandered off, if they would be so kind as to return them or at least let us see them, borrow them. Mm-hmm. So we were able to either restore pieces that were returned or use those pieces to recreate stuff in a number of cases where somebody might have had one, but we needed 20. So, one was good because it enabled us to replicate the other 19, but things of that nature.
As we stepped inside, I asked about some of the highlights of the building. And while the entire station is quite simply exquisite, Dan and I looked up at the ceiling in the Grand Hall.
Guastavino was a father and son Spanish engineering team who in the late 19th century popularized in the United States the system of self-supporting terracotta tiles to create these vaults. So these are actually Guastavino vaults. At one time there were about 2,000 Guastavino tile vaults in the country, and there are only about 600 of them that still exist, and you're looking at 3 of them now. But when we got into the nooks and crannies of the building trying to figure out exactly what we had gotten ourselves into, the Crispin Brinker team discovered that one of the main supports for this ceiling was only about a year or two away from structural failure. And so had the building sat for just another year or two, we might have lost the ceiling because those are self-supporting tiles. The restoration of this building could not have come at a more perfect time. More perfect time because we were so close to losing the ceiling, but also a lot of the technology that was used to recreate missing pieces did not exist 10 years ago. So had this project started 10, 20 years ago, what you see would not have been possible. Case in point, if you look at all these doorways around the building, you'll see that that decorative panel, it's called a frieze, they were all stone. And so when we put out that call in 2018 for any wayward pieces of the train station, we had a collector in the state of Maine reach out to us and said that he had one of those panels. And so we sent a team out to Maine. We 3D scanned the original frieze and then used a laser cutter to etch carbon copies of the original frieze in the brand new Mankato. Wow. So what you see is as close as you could possibly get to what was there because it's a Xerox copy of the original, basically. But we couldn't have done that 10 years ago, 5 years ago maybe. It's really, this restoration came at the perfect time.
And while the opening of the Michigan Central Station is still in its early stages, the building will eventually house corporate office space, including the Ford Motor Company. Google Code X had just moved in when I popped by. A hotel occupying 3 stories of the 18-story building is in the works. Requests for event space are already coming in, and public spaces, including parkland where the rail tracks once laid, are underway. But the $950 million investment spans 30 acres and includes Detroit's Center of Gravity for Innovation, the new lab, in the former mail processing facility adjacent to the station. I said goodbye to Dan in the station's former waiting room. He shared powerful yet emotional stories of passengers and visitors who came to say hello and goodbye over the decades, and his hopes for the space going forward.
Just an incredibly emotionally charged space. The excitement, the elation, the optimism, the hope of people arriving in Detroit, but also the sadness, goodbyes, the hellos and the goodbyes. Yeah. And it all happened in this room from 1913 until 1988. we're hoping there'll be a lot more hellos and happiness in this new chapter of the building story. But it's just an incredible space, and all of it, like the brick, the metal. You look at the brick. There's a bullet hole over there. It's like the room is as it was.
Tall Stories is a Monocle production from the team behind The Urbanist. This episode was written by Mandy Sinclair and produced and edited by David Stevens. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast to receive new episodes every week. I'm Andrew Tuck. Goodbye, and thank you for listening, City Lovers.